Good afternoon, Carters. I'm back with another video, and this video is on the Mikuni TM28 millimeter pump round carburetor. So this is not a stock carburetor. This has a aftermarket modification that in the karting world we call a pump around. So this is not going to be a detailed video on the anatomy of this particular carburetor. It's going to be a quick overview of the pump around, and I'm going to go over the carburetor and the fuel pump. I will do another video of the anatomy of the carburetor itself and a separate video on the fuel pump. So let's get to it. So as you'll see in this carburetor, there are two nipples. This nipple is the OEM inlet. So this is your fuel supply. Now on a pump around carburetor, there are no floats. There's no needle valve. All of that is removed, and this scavenger tube is installed, and it's set at a predetermined height on the inside to mimic the float height. And the reason we've done this in karting is because with the lateral forces, these carburetors aren't designed for lateral forces, and you end up with a lot of sloshing, fuel overflow out of your vent lines, bogging, hesitation. Now, this particular pump around system, it is not perfect by all means, but it came out in the 90s and is still widely used today. It was a good solution to basically using a motorcycle carburetor on a go-kart. And it's, again, just some innovation, if you will. So again, this is a pump around carburetor. This is not an OEM stock TM carburetor. So, as I mentioned, this is your fuel inlet. So your fuel supply attaches here. Now, the inlet on these Mikuni carburetors, 1/4-inch fuel line is a little bit loose. So sometimes you'll have to use like a 3/16 fuel line or a metric fuel line for a snugger fit. And then I like the use of hose clamps, but I like the spring hose clamps that wrap around twice. And then you need a little plier to open them and keep the fuel line secured to the nipple. So just keep that in mind. I have in the past actually run a filter in between the pump and the carburetor just so I could reduce the fuel line down to a 3/16 for a snugger fit. But you can kind of trial and error. Now this tube here, as I mentioned, this is the scavenger tube. And again, this is your outlet. So the fuel returning back to your fuel tank. Now, when you have a pump around system, you're going to need at least 3 fuel tank nipples on your fuel tank. You'll need one for your supply line. You'll need one for your return line, and you need one for your vent line. So the tank must be vented. If the tank is not vented to atmosphere, you will have many problems with your fuel system. And that goes for a stock carb as well as a pump around carb. And it's okay to oversize the vent line. That is perfectly fine. It is okay to also oversize the return line at the tank, because you really want to minimize any restrictions you have going back to the tank, or when it comes to equilibrium and pressure. You don't want to pressurize the tank, and you don't want to create a vacuum inside the tank, because then all hell breaks loose. So normally you would want to have a minimum of a 1/4-inch ID on your nipples on the gas tank. Some gas tanks you can't do it. You can only get like a 3/16 minimum ID, so you got to be very careful. You don't want any restrictions on the return line, and you don't want any restrictions on your vent line. So back to it. OEM inlet. That's your inlet from your fuel pump. This is your scavenger tube that will also go to a secondary fuel pump that returns the fuel to the fuel tank. These two nipples here, these are vent lines. And typically in the karting world, we just run these up. And you want to run them up higher than the top of the carburetor because these do fill up with fuel on sloshing. So if you drain them down, you'll always battle fuel draining out of the carburetor and making a mess, or it'll overflow your catch can. So again, we typically run these up. And these are just a goofy size. 1/8-inch fuel line doesn't quite fit snugly enough. There's actually some product out there from Kian and Mikuni. It's OEM vent lines. Those work the best for these nipples. And on a pump round system, the float bowl overflow nipple, which you see right here, that is plugged. So we don't run one. Now if it's not plugged, you can run a long overflow line that's higher than your vent lines and everything else, but you are going to risk fuel getting stuck in there. In fact, it will get stuck in there. So most people plug these, and a lot of times they plug them from the inside, because on a pump round system, that is not used. Now, we have the fuel pump. This is not an OEM Mikuni fuel pump. This is actually two fuel pump bodies attached to a machine center pulse plate. Now, before you take any of this stuff apart, if the cart is new to you and you're trying to figure things out, what you want to do is mark everything. So as you can see here, all the fuel pumps have arrows. The arrows indicate the direction of fuel. And honestly, it doesn't matter what pump you use as far as on each side, because they're identical. They're on a pulse plate. What matters is the flow of the fuel. So nipple, arrow, nipple, nipple, and then arrow. So you can see the fuel is traveling through this pump this direction. Now these pumps, OEM-wise, have two outlets. One outlet on this pump has been plugged. We go straight through. Straight through. Follow the arrows. It's the arrows. Follow the arrows. Center plate, machined billet pulse plate. That's your pulse. This goes to your engine's pulse line, which in many cases on a CR80 is installed near the reed cage on the cylinder itself, or some guys even install them in the cylinder near the transfer port on the external side. So that is your pulse line. The pulse line basically powers these pumps. So it creates suctions or vacuums and a positive pressure. And what happens, negative and positive pressure, basically takes these diaphragms and moves them in and out. So that's what the pulse plate is for. So it basically, in theory, equally distributes the vacuum and the pulses to both pumps. And again, this other pump also has arrows. Now, in many cases, you'll see here, this arrow is facing upwards, so the fuel is going to travel that direction. I'm going to rotate the pump. This arrow is traveling downward, so the fuel is going to go this direction. Now again, none of this orientation matters. You can move this whole assembly on the pulse plate to wherever you want the nipples to end up for best installation. The only thing that matters is the fuel travels in the direction of the arrows. So, for example, if you wanted to make this one your inlet to the carburetor, follow the arrow into the inlet. Again, the small brass nipple on the Mikuni TM, that is your inlet. Now we're going to flip this over. Scavenger tube is going to go to the other. Let's see, that's going that direction to the inlet. So I'm going to have to flip it over this way so I don't confuse you. This area, my English. This arrow is going away from the carburetor. So that's going to be your scavenger tube. So this nipple will go to the scavenger tube of fuel going away from the carburetor. So to really simplify things on this carburetor, now that I've gone over the basics and the plumbing. Inlet, exit, scavenger tube. Fuel direction, follow the arrow. Fuel direction, follow the arrow. Middle, nipple, pulse. So basically, what you're looking for, if you're kind of a schematic type of a person, inlet, into there, goes into the float bowl, reaches a certain height inside the float bowl, wherever the scavenger tube height is set on the inside. The scavenger tube then sucks the fuel out, and this is returned back to the tank. So into the float bowl. Whatever's not used by the carburetor is getting returned back to the gas tank through the scavenger tube. This is going to be a return to the tank. I hope you found that video helpful. And later I will post a video of the actual schematics, or I guess breakdown of this carburetor, and then also one of the pump round carb. So this was just basically an overview of the pump round.